One of my favorite performers was the late, great Elaine Stritch. In her one-woman show at Liberty, Miss Stritch says, "There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that I have got a terrific acceptance speech for a Tony. The bad news is I've had it for 45 years. Good news and bad news are traveling companions. Let's try it. You get to respond yay to the good news and boo to the bad news. Ready? God so loved the world. Monty Python and the Knights of the Holy Grail, and there was great rejoicing. Yay. This is the day that the Lord has made. The Lord God sent Adam and Eve out of the garden to till the ground from which they were taken. At once, Judas came up to Jesus and kissed him. God gave us the 10 Commandments. See, there was a hesitation. Good news or bad news? The way in which most of us were taught the commandments made them sound like restrictions. Here's the stuff you can't do, and here's the stuff you have to do, is the way it sounded. Living with God, if it involved commandments, didn't sound like something a sensible person would want to do. And then to frighten us into faith, they dangled us over the hellfire and brimstone and taught an advanced course in teeth gnashing so we would be ready if we didn't follow the rules. So here are the commandments again. Are they good news or are they bad news? To get a proper start at the subject, we have to back up just a bit to what happens just before the giving of the commandments to the people. God says, "If you obey my voice and keep my commandment, you shall be my treasured possession out of all peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." God is offering the people something they could not obtain for themselves. God is offering them an identity as God's own people, God's treasured possession, the servant nation by which the world will come to know God. The qualifier of the statement is if. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession out of all people. If you would be who God invites and calls you to be, then the life you are called to live will be different from other ways of living. If you will be God's covenant people, then here's how you do it. God has been traveling with these people. God has heard their grumblings. God has seen their tendency to abandon God's way. God has experienced what it's like to have the people lose their trust in God. God knows that without some direction, some instruction, some guidelines, they will not be the people God created and calls them to be. And that leads us to the 10 Commandments. The commandments lead us to see what life can be, what life can look like. The commandments create a freedom for being in relationship with God and with one another. The first commandment sets the tone. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. As tempting as it may be to place other things as the supreme authority in life, God tells the people, if you want to be able to relate to me and to one another, then you have to begin with God as God and no other gods, no matter how popular or powerful or plentiful. And then everything else that follows is about how to live in the freedom God offers. What can life look like? If we give up making idols for ourselves, then we can begin to see the glory of God's handiwork. If we stop using God's name as a way to manipulate people, then we can love them and care for them more readily. If we embrace the Sabbath, then we can live a more refreshed and connected life. If we honor mother and father, then we can learn the importance of these sacred connections. If we do not murder, then we may not have to live in fear. If we do not commit adultery, then we may be able to discover new and deeper pathways of trust. If we do not steal, then we might lighten the burden of our worries about protecting what we call ours. If we will speak only the truth, then we might find an easier way of living. If we give up yearning for what others have, then we just might discover the joy of what is already ours. The commandments create space for us to be truly who God created us to be. Now, if we say that they are rules that must be followed, we make them bad news. If we see these commandments as establishing wide and generous boundaries that allow us freedom to live genuinely and authentically, then they are good news. If we insist on continuing to point out that they are the 10 Commandments and not the 10 suggestions, we only make them less desirable and we diminish their power. But if we see the commandments as the superstructure of life as God intended it to be, well, then they become good news. The commandments are promises, not restrictions. When we embrace these commandments and make them part of who we are and how we live, there is the promise of blessing, rewarding life, peace, and wholeness. This is the path that leads to shalom, the wholeness, beauty, and integration of life. On this Sunday, when we focus on peacemaking and witnessing to our faith, what better way is there to make peace and demonstrate life as it was meant to be than to live the good news of God's commandments? What better way is there to create relationship between ourselves and our neighbors than to live the life God fashioned us to live? How better to connect with God than to accept God's way of life and God's way of living as our own? There's good news and there's bad news. When it comes to the 10 Commandments, it's all about how you approach the terms of God's covenant. If you see them as restrictions and restraints, you'll find no good news. If you see them as holding within them the power to free us from fear, from worry, from mistrust, from greed, from disconnection, then you just may discover that the 10 Commandments create some very good news. Very good news. For now and evermore. Amen.